The summer of 1940, one had begun with astonishing speed and brutal momentum, as Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Millions of German soldiers surged across the Soviet border in three massive army groups, each tasked with a strategic objective that Adolf Hitler believed would shatter the Soviet Union within months. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, the historic cradle of the Russian Revolution. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the three, aimed directly for Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the Soviet Union. Army Group South pushed into the fertile lands of Ukraine, seeking resources vital to sustaining the German war machine. By midsummer, German forces had achieved staggering territorial gains, capturing vast numbers of Soviet troops and destroying entire Soviet armies. Yet beneath the surface of these victories, new challenges began to emerge, challenges that would soon transform the invasion into a prolonged and devastating struggle. As German forces raced deeper into Soviet territory, the Red Army struggled to recover from the shock of invasion. Stalin's leadership had been paralyzed in the early days of the war, and the purges of the late 1930s had stripped the Soviet military of many experienced commanders. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded and annihilated during massive encirclement battles, most notably at Minsk and Smolensk. However, despite catastrophic losses, Soviet resistance did not collapse as German planners had predicted. Instead, the Soviet Union began mobilizing its vast manpower reserves and relocating entire industries eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Factories, workers, and equipment were transported thousands of kilometers away from the advancing German armies, ensuring that Soviet war production would continue even as territory was lost. By late summer, Hitler faced a critical strategic decision that would influence the course of the entire war. German generals, particularly those commanding Army Group Center, urged a direct and immediate assault on Moscow. They argued that capturing the Soviet capital would cripple Soviet communications, logistics, and morale. Moscow was not only the political center of the Soviet Union, but also a vital railway hub connecting multiple fronts. Yet Hitler believed that economic targets and resource-rich territories were more important than political symbolism. He temporarily redirected armored units from Army Group Center to assist operations in Ukraine and Leningrad. This decision delayed the advance toward Moscow and allowed the Soviet Union valuable time to strengthen its defenses. While Army Group Center paused, Army Group North pushed relentlessly toward Leningrad. The city held immense symbolic significance. Named after Vladimir Lenin, it represented the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution and stood as a major industrial and cultural center. German forces, supported by Finnish troops advancing from the north, gradually tightened their grip around the city. By September 1941, Leningrad was nearly surrounded. However, instead of launching a full-scale assault, Hitler ordered the city to be besieged and starved into submission. The German High Command believed that conquering Leningrad through direct urban combat would result in unacceptable casualties. Instead, the plan was to isolate the city completely, cutting off food, supplies, and escape routes, and allowing starvation and bombardment to destroy resistance. The siege of Leningrad soon became one of the most horrific humanitarian disasters of the Second World War. Nearly 3 million civilians were trapped inside the city when German and Finnish forces sealed the final land routes. Food shortages appeared almost immediately. German artillery and aerial bombardments targeted warehouses and infrastructure, deliberately destroying food reserves. As winter approached, the situation inside the city grew catastrophic. Ration levels dropped to starvation quantities, with some civilians receiving less than a few hundred calories per day. People collapsed in the streets from hunger and exhaustion. Families burned furniture and books to stay warm during the brutal winter. Yet despite unimaginable suffering, the city refused to surrender. Meanwhile, Army Group Center prepared for the long-awaited assault on Moscow. The German High Command launched Operation Typhoon in late September 1941, a massive offensive designed to capture the Soviet capital before winter. Over 1 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, surged forward in a coordinated attack. The initial stages of Operation Typhoon achieved significant success. German forces encircled large Soviet formations near Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Once again, it appeared that the Red Army might collapse under the weight of German military superiority. However, Soviet resistance hardened as the Germans approached Moscow. Stalin ordered the construction of extensive defensive fortifications around the city. Civilians, including women, elderly citizens, and teenagers, were mobilized to dig trenches, build anti-tank barriers, and construct defensive positions. Moscow itself transformed into a fortress. Government institutions prepared evacuation plans, and some diplomatic missions relocated eastward. Yet Stalin made a symbolic decision that would strengthen Soviet morale. He chose to remain in Moscow, refusing to abandon the capital even as German forces advanced closer. By October, the German offensive encountered an unexpected and formidable enemy, the Russian autumn. Heavy rains turned roads into seas of mud, a phenomenon known as the Rasputitsa. German tanks and supply vehicles became trapped in thick, sticky terrain that slowed their advance to a crawl. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and fuel and ammunition struggled to reach frontline units. German soldiers, who had expected a quick victory, now faced deteriorating conditions and increasing resistance from Soviet forces that had regrouped and reorganized. Despite these difficulties, German forces pushed onward. By November 1941, advanced German units could see the outskirts of Moscow. Some reconnaissance patrols reported glimpsing the distant spires of the Kremlin. The psychological impact of reaching the Soviet capital's doorstep energized German troops, but their strength was rapidly fading. The Wehrmacht had suffered enormous casualties during months of continuous combat. Equipment was worn out, and winter clothing had not been adequately supplied because German planners believed the campaign would end before winter began. As temperatures plunged below freezing, German soldiers faced one of the harshest winters in recorded Russian history. Weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold, vehicles failed to start, and frostbite claimed thousands of casualties. Soldiers improvised by wrapping themselves in blankets and scavenging winter gear from captured Soviet supplies. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union prepared to launch a counteroffensive. Intelligence reports from Soviet spy networks revealed that Japan would not attack Siberia in the near future. This allowed Stalin to transfer experienced Siberian divisions to defend Moscow. These troops were trained and equipped for winter warfare and arrived at a critical moment. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive along the Moscow front. Fresh Soviet divisions, supported by tanks and artillery, struck exhausted German units that were unprepared for a large-scale defensive battle. The Soviet assault pushed German forces backward, marking the first major strategic defeat of the Wehrmacht during World War II. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the German army was forced to retreat from positions dangerously close to Moscow. While the Battle of Moscow raged, the siege of Leningrad continued to intensify. The winter of 1940–1942 became known as one of the darkest periods in the city's history. Starvation, disease, and constant bombardment claimed hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Yet the Soviet government organized a lifeline across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life. Trucks transported food and supplies across the ice, while evacuating civilians from the starving city. The route was extremely dangerous, constantly targeted by German artillery and aircraft, and many vehicles fell through the ice. Nevertheless, it provided a crucial supply connection that prevented total collapse. Inside Leningrad, cultural life continued despite the suffering. Musicians performed concerts, including the famous premiere of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, which became a symbol of resistance. The performance was broadcast across the city and even directed toward German lines as a demonstration of defiance. Such acts of resilience strengthened civilian morale and reinforced Soviet determination to hold the city at any cost. Back on the Moscow front, the Soviet counteroffensive forced German troops into a defensive posture along a broad front. Hitler reacted by issuing strict orders prohibiting retreat. He insisted that German forces hold their positions regardless of casualties or logistical challenges. Some German commanders defied these orders and withdrew to more defensible positions, saving their troops from encirclement. Others obeyed Hitler's commands and suffered devastating losses. The internal conflict between military strategy and Hitler's personal directives would become a recurring theme throughout the Eastern Front campaign. The failure to capture Moscow represented a turning point in Operation Barbarossa. German forces had underestimated Soviet resilience, logistical capacity, and ability to mobilize new armies. The war in the East transformed from a rapid invasion into a prolonged conflict of attrition. German planners had expected the Soviet Union to collapse within months, but instead, they faced an opponent capable of sustaining enormous losses while continuing to fight with relentless determination. Meanwhile, the siege of Leningrad stretched into years, becoming one of the longest and deadliest sieges in military history. Civilians endured starvation levels rarely seen in modern warfare, and entire families perished during the harsh winters. Yet the city remained unconquered. Soviet forces launched repeated attempts to break the siege, gradually opening narrow supply corridors that weakened German encirclement. The defense of Leningrad became a symbol of Soviet endurance and sacrifice, reinforcing national unity against the German invasion. As 1941 ended, both sides recognized that the war on the Eastern Front would be far longer and more destructive than originally anticipated. German forces held vast territories across the Soviet Union, but their failure to capture Moscow and Leningrad prevented a decisive victory. The Soviet Union, though severely wounded, had survived the initial onslaught and was preparing to rebuild its military strength. Factories relocated east of the Urals began producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at astonishing rates. Soviet commanders learned from early mistakes and adapted their tactics to counter German strategies. The winter battles around Moscow demonstrated that the Red Army could not only defend, but also launch powerful offensives. The survival of Leningrad proved that German siege warfare could not break Soviet morale. These events marked the beginning of a shift in momentum that would eventually reshape the entire course of World War II. Operation Barbarossa had begun as a lightning campaign, designed to destroy the Soviet Union in a single season. Instead, it evolved into a brutal and prolonged struggle that consumed millions of lives and resources on both sides. The German failure before Moscow forced the Wehrmacht into a harsh reality it had never fully prepared for. Operation Barbarossa had been planned as a short, decisive campaign, modeled on Germany's earlier lightning victories in Poland and Western Europe. German logistics, supply chains, and troop equipment were designed around speed and mobility rather than prolonged winter warfare. Now, as temperatures plummeted across the Eastern Front, German soldiers faced conditions that tested their endurance beyond imagination. Rifles froze solid. Machine gun lubricants thickened into useless sludge. Engines stalled in the cold, forcing soldiers to light fires beneath vehicles just to keep them operational. Frostbite casualties mounted rapidly, often exceeding battlefield injuries in some units. Soviet forces, by contrast, increasingly adapted to the brutal environment. The arrival of Siberian divisions proved especially critical. These troops had been trained in winter combat and were equipped with insulated clothing, skis, and camouflage suitable for snow-covered terrain. Their arrival not only strengthened Soviet military capability, but also provided a psychological boost to defenders who had spent months enduring retreat and devastation. Soviet commanders began implementing coordinated counterattacks designed to exploit German exhaustion and overextended supply lines. Rather than attempting large encirclement operations immediately, Soviet forces focused on relentless pressure, forcing German units to retreat gradually while suffering constant attrition. During this period, Joseph Stalin also restructured Soviet command authority. Having initially interfered heavily in military decision-making, Stalin began allowing experienced generals such as Georgy Zhukov greater operational freedom. Zhukov, already recognized for his organizational brilliance and ruthless determination, played a central role in orchestrating the defense of Moscow. He prioritized layered defensive systems, ensuring that even if one defensive line collapsed, additional lines would slow German progress. This depth of defense proved crucial in preventing a decisive breakthrough by the Wehrmacht. While Moscow dominated headlines as the central objective of Operation Typhoon, the struggle around Leningrad continued with equal intensity, though in a very different form. Unlike Moscow, which remained a battleground of maneuver warfare, Leningrad became a frozen prison city surrounded by enemy forces. German and Finnish armies maintained a tightening ring around the city, while artillery bombardments and air raids targeted civilian infrastructure. German planners hoped that starvation would accomplish what direct assault could not. However, maintaining the siege also placed heavy logistical demands on German forces, which were already stretched across an enormous front. The road of life across Lake Ladoga remained Leningrad's fragile connection to the outside world. During winter months, Soviet convoys crossed the frozen lake under constant threat of German artillery and aircraft attacks. Drivers navigated icy surfaces in darkness, often using minimal headlights to avoid detection. Many trucks disappeared beneath the ice, taking drivers and precious supplies with them. Despite these losses, the route allowed limited food and ammunition deliveries that prevented complete collapse. It also enabled the evacuation of children and vulnerable civilians, saving tens of thousands of lives. Inside Leningrad, starvation reshaped daily existence. Food rations fell to levels barely capable of sustaining human life. Bread, often mixed with sawdust or other substitutes, became the primary source of calories. Citizens resorted to boiling leather belts, wallpaper paste, and animal feed in desperate attempts to survive. Hospitals overflowed with malnourished patients, and city morgues struggled to keep pace with the rising death toll. Yet Soviet authorities continued broadcasting messages of resistance and unity, reinforcing the idea that Leningrad's survival symbolized the survival of the Soviet Union itself. Meanwhile, along the Moscow front, the Soviet counteroffensive expanded into a broader winter campaign stretching hundreds of kilometers. Soviet forces aimed to push German troops away from the capital and relieve pressure across central sectors of the Eastern Front. German units, weakened by months of continuous fighting, struggled to maintain cohesion. Entire formations faced encirclement as Soviet forces launched coordinated attacks against vulnerable flanks. However, the Wehrmacht's discipline and defensive tactics prevented total collapse. German troops often established strong defensive positions in villages and forested areas, using artillery and machine gun nests to repel repeated Soviet assaults. Hitler's leadership during this crisis became increasingly rigid and authoritarian. He removed several senior commanders whom he believed lacked determination and replaced them with officers who would strictly obey his directives. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs occasionally prevented catastrophic routes, but it also resulted in unnecessary casualties. German commanders were denied the flexibility to withdraw from exposed positions, forcing soldiers to defend locations with little strategic value. This growing interference by Hitler began eroding the operational independence that had previously contributed to German military success. As winter deepened, the Soviet Union intensified efforts to mobilize its economy for total war. Industrial complexes relocated beyond the Ural Mountains began operating at extraordinary levels of productivity. Soviet factories produced thousands of T-34 tanks, which would soon become one of the most feared armored vehicles of the war. The T-34 combined mobility, firepower, and armor protection in a design that outperformed many German tanks during early encounters. Soviet aircraft production also increased dramatically, gradually restoring air power that had been devastated during the opening months of Barbarossa. In Leningrad, Soviet commanders launched limited offensive operations aimed at weakening German encirclement lines. Though these attacks rarely achieved immediate success, they forced German forces to divert resources toward maintaining siege positions rather than reinforcing other fronts. Soviet naval units in the Baltic Sea also provided artillery support to defenders, using battleships and cruisers to bombard German positions. These naval guns became a crucial element in the city's defense, delivering heavy firepower that German ground artillery could not easily match. The human cost of the siege reached unimaginable levels during the winter of 1941–1942. Historical estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of civilians died during this single winter alone. Streets filled with silent bodies frozen in place, often collected by burial teams only when weather conditions allowed. Yet acts of solidarity and courage continued to define daily life. Volunteers distributed food rations despite risking starvation themselves. Medical workers treated patients with almost no supplies. Teachers continued educating children in freezing classrooms, determined to preserve a sense of normalcy in a city on the brink of destruction. Back at Moscow, the Red Army's winter offensive achieved strategic success by pushing German forces between 100 and 250 kilometers away from the capital in some sectors. The Soviet victory shattered the German perception that the Soviet Union was incapable of mounting coordinated large-scale counterattacks. German soldiers who had previously believed the war would end quickly now faced the grim reality of a prolonged and brutal conflict against a determined and resourceful enemy. Despite Soviet successes, the Red Army also suffered enormous casualties during the winter campaign. Soviet commanders often relied on massive infantry assaults that resulted in heavy losses. Yet the Soviet Union possessed a vast population capable of sustaining such sacrifices, while Germany faced increasing strain on manpower reserves. The Eastern Front consumed soldiers, equipment, and resources at a rate that Germany struggled to replace. By early 1942, the Eastern Front stabilized temporarily, as both sides regrouped and prepared for future campaigns. German forces constructed defensive fortifications along newly established front lines, while Soviet commanders planned further offensives designed to exploit German weakness. The war had evolved into a struggle of endurance, industrial production, and logistical capacity rather than rapid maneuver warfare. The psychological impact of failing to capture Moscow extended far beyond the battlefield. Within Germany, propaganda had portrayed Operation Barbarossa as a decisive campaign that would eliminate the Soviet threat permanently. As news of prolonged fighting and mounting casualties reached the German public, confidence in a quick victory began to erode. Although German censorship prevented widespread knowledge of military setbacks, rumors circulated among soldiers, families, gradually undermining morale. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Moscow and survival of Leningrad became powerful propaganda symbols. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the battles as proof of socialist resilience and national unity. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and endurance circulated widely, strengthening public determination to continue resisting German occupation. The Soviet government framed the conflict as a patriotic war for national survival, transcending ideological divisions and rallying diverse populations across the vast Soviet territory. Meanwhile, partisan warfare intensified behind German lines. Soviet resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations targeting German supply routes, railways, and communication networks. These partisan groups disrupted German logistics and forced the Wehrmacht to allocate additional troops to security operations, further stretching already limited manpower. In regions surrounding Leningrad and Moscow, partisan activities became particularly effective due to support from local populations and difficult terrain that hindered German counterinsurgency efforts. The experiences of individual soldiers on both sides illustrated the brutal nature of the Eastern Front. German soldiers recorded diary entries describing endless marches through frozen landscapes, constant artillery bombardments, and the psychological toll of fighting an enemy that refused to surrender. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had witnessed German atrocities in occupied territories, fought with intense determination fueled by personal loss and patriotic motivation. The conflict transformed into a war of survival, where ideological hatred and fear amplified violence on an unprecedented scale. As spring approached in 1942, melting snow once again turned battlefields into muddy wastelands, temporarily slowing major operations. Both German and Soviet armies used this period to rebuild strength, reorganize units, and plan new offensives. German High Command began developing plans for renewed campaigns aimed at capturing strategic economic resources in southern Soviet territories. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders prepared to maintain pressure across multiple fronts, hoping to prevent Germany from regaining strategic initiative. The battles for Moscow and Leningrad had already reshaped the war in fundamental ways. They demonstrated that Germany could not achieve a quick and decisive victory against the Soviet Union. They also proved that Soviet industrial relocation and mass mobilization could sustain prolonged warfare. Most importantly, these battles revealed that morale, leadership, and national resilience could influence the outcome of modern industrial warfare as much as military technology and tactical skill. As the brutal winter of 1941 slowly gave way to early 1942, both the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army found themselves exhausted yet determined to continue the struggle. The Eastern Front had transformed into a colossal battlefield stretching thousands of kilometers, where millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in a relentless cycle of violence, survival, and endurance. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the continuing ordeal of Leningrad and the fragile defensive stability around Moscow. These two fronts, though different in their military dynamics, symbolized the broader turning point of Operation Barbarossa and foreshadowed the prolonged war that would define the next several years. Inside Leningrad, survival had become an everyday battle more terrifying than the bombardments that echoed across the frozen city. By early 1942, the population had been reduced dramatically by starvation, disease, and relentless shelling. Citizens faced an unimaginable daily routine centered entirely around obtaining food and preserving warmth. Bread rations were strictly regulated, often consisting of small, dark loaves mixed with substitutes such as cellulose, bran, or even crushed seeds. People spent hours waiting in freezing lines for rations that barely sustained life. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leading to widespread outbreaks of illness, including typhus and dysentery. Hospitals, already damaged by air raids, struggled to function as doctors worked without adequate medicines or equipment. Despite these horrors, Soviet authorities in Leningrad maintained strict organizational control over the city's defense and social structure. Workers were assigned to essential industries producing artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and spare parts for military vehicles. Even in starvation conditions, factory workers continued their shifts, driven by the belief that their labor contributed directly to the survival of their city and nation. Civil defense units cleared rubble from bombed streets, extinguished fires caused by artillery strikes, and repaired infrastructure whenever possible. The Soviet government carefully documented civilian suffering and heroism, using these accounts to inspire resistance throughout the Soviet Union. One of the most remarkable acts of defiance during the siege occurred in August 1942, when Leningrad hosted the performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, known as the Leningrad Symphony. The composer had begun writing the symphony during the early stages of the siege before being evacuated eastward. The Soviet government organized an orchestra composed of starving musicians, many of whom were brought back from the front lines or hospitals. Rehearsals took place under constant bombardment, with musicians often collapsing from exhaustion. When the symphony was finally performed, it was broadcast through loudspeakers across the city and directed toward German positions. The music symbolized unbreakable resistance and became one of the most powerful cultural moments of World War II. While Leningrad endured starvation, the front lines around Moscow evolved into a tense and unstable defensive stalemate. After the Soviet winter counteroffensive pushed German forces away from the capital, both sides rushed to fortify their positions. German engineers constructed extensive trench systems, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles designed to halt further Soviet advances. The Wehrmacht still possessed formidable combat experience and tactical discipline, allowing it to stabilize the front despite its weakened condition. German units reorganized, replenished their ranks with reinforcements, and repaired damaged equipment in preparation for future campaigns. However, Germany faced severe logistical challenges that extended beyond immediate battlefield concerns. The enormous distances of the Eastern Front strained transportation networks, and supply convoys often struggled to deliver fuel, ammunition, and winter gear to frontline troops. Railroads, which formed the backbone of German logistics, required constant conversion from Soviet wide-gauge tracks to European standard gauge. This labor-intensive process slowed the movement of supplies and reinforcements. Meanwhile, partisan fighters sabotaged rail lines and communication networks, further complicating German logistics and forcing the Wehrmacht to divert valuable resources toward anti-partisan operations. Soviet partisans played an increasingly important role in supporting frontline operations around Moscow and Leningrad. Operating deep behind German lines, these irregular fighters disrupted supply routes, destroyed bridges, and launched ambushes against isolated German units. Many partisans consisted of local civilians who had witnessed German occupation policies, including mass executions and forced labor deportations. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain allowed them to strike unexpectedly before disappearing into forests and rural landscapes. German forces responded with harsh counterinsurgency campaigns that often targeted entire villages suspected of aiding partisans, escalating the cycle of violence across occupied territories. Meanwhile, Soviet military leadership focused heavily on rebuilding its operational strength. The Red Army underwent significant reforms following the disastrous losses of 1941. Training programs improved tactical coordination between infantry, artillery, and armored units. Command structures became more centralized, allowing for quicker response to changing battlefield conditions. Soviet industry, now operating safely east of the Ural Mountains, dramatically increased production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The T-34 tank, in particular, became the cornerstone of Soviet armored warfare. Its sloped armor design and wide tracks provided superior protection and mobility, especially in muddy and snowy terrain where German tanks struggled. Soviet air power also began recovering from early war devastation. New aircraft models entered service, and Soviet pilots gained valuable combat experience during defensive battles. Although the German Luftwaffe remained technologically advanced, it faced increasing difficulty maintaining air superiority across such an enormous battlefield. German aircraft suffered mechanical wear from constant operations, and supply shortages limited maintenance capabilities. As Soviet aircraft production increased, aerial combat became more balanced, reducing Germany's ability to conduct uncontested bombing campaigns. For German soldiers stationed around Moscow, daily life became a grueling routine of defensive vigilance. Soldiers faced constant Soviet probing attacks designed to test defensive strength and exhaust German manpower. Artillery duels echoed across frozen landscapes, and night raids frequently disrupted German positions. German morale, though still disciplined, began showing signs of strain. Soldiers wrote letters home describing endless cold, shortages of supplies, and fear of Soviet winter offensives. Many soldiers realized that the war in the East differed drastically from earlier campaigns in Western Europe. Instead of rapid victories, they now faced an enemy willing to endure enormous losses while continuing to fight relentlessly. The German High Command responded by shifting strategic focus toward southern Soviet territories, believing that capturing oil fields in the Caucasus would provide vital fuel resources needed to sustain the German war effort. While these new plans developed, German forces along the Moscow front adopted a defensive posture, consolidating positions and conserving strength. This shift marked a significant departure from Germany's earlier strategy of rapid, continuous offensive operations. The Wehrmacht had transitioned from aggressor to defender in key sectors of the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders saw an opportunity to maintain pressure on German forces across multiple fronts. Although Soviet offensives sometimes suffered heavy casualties due to insufficient coordination or overconfidence, they achieved important strategic goals by preventing Germany from regrouping effectively. Soviet leadership understood that time favored their growing industrial capacity and manpower reserves. Each month that Germany failed to achieve decisive victory allowed the Soviet Union to rebuild its military strength and prepare for future counteroffensives. Back in Leningrad, the siege continued with relentless brutality. During spring and summer months, melting ice on Lake Ladoga transformed the Road of Life into a water-based supply route using barges and small ships. German artillery and airstrikes continued targeting these convoys, yet Soviet forces managed to deliver enough supplies to prevent complete starvation. The city slowly restored limited agricultural production through rooftop gardens and urban farming projects. Civilians cultivated vegetables in every available open space, demonstrating extraordinary resilience in adapting to wartime scarcity. The Soviet military also launched several attempts to break the siege through offensive operations aimed at connecting Leningrad with mainland Soviet territory. These operations involved coordinated attacks from both inside and outside the encirclement ring. Although early attempts failed and resulted in heavy casualties, they forced German forces to maintain large troop deployments around the city. This prevented Germany from reallocating those troops to other critical fronts, indirectly aiding Soviet operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. Human stories emerging from Leningrad during this period became powerful symbols of endurance. Diaries kept by civilians documented daily struggles for survival and emotional resilience amid overwhelming despair. Parents sacrificed their own rations to feed children. Medical staff continued treating patients despite suffering from starvation themselves. Cultural institutions preserved historical artifacts and artwork, protecting national heritage even as the city faced annihilation. These personal acts of courage formed a collective narrative that strengthened Soviet national identity and determination. As 1942 progressed, both the battles for Moscow and the siege of Leningrad demonstrated a fundamental transformation in modern warfare. The conflict had evolved into a total war where entire societies mobilized for survival. Industrial production, civilian morale, transportation networks, and agricultural output became as crucial as battlefield tactics. The Soviet Union demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to reorganize its entire national structure to support prolonged warfare, while Germany struggled to sustain its initial momentum across vast distances and harsh climates. By mid-1942, the Eastern Front had stabilized into a deadly equilibrium. Germany still controlled vast Soviet territories, but its failure to capture Moscow and Leningrad had denied Hitler the decisive victory he believed necessary to force Soviet surrender. The Soviet Union, though devastated, had survived the initial invasion and was preparing to launch major offensives that would gradually shift the balance of power. The defense of Moscow had shattered the myth of German invincibility, while the survival of Leningrad embodied the extraordinary resilience of a population fighting against starvation and destruction. By the latter half of 1942, the prolonged struggles around Moscow and Leningrad had begun shaping the broader direction of the Eastern Front. Both cities had survived Germany's initial assault, but the fighting remained relentless. While global attention increasingly shifted toward the massive German offensive, moving toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, the northern and central fronts continued to bleed both armies in a grinding war of attrition. The survival of Moscow and Leningrad had forced Germany to spread its forces across multiple strategic objectives, weakening its ability to deliver a decisive blow anywhere along the front. Around Moscow, Soviet forces maintained consistent pressure through limited offensives designed to exhaust German defensive strength. These operations often focused on retaking key transportation routes, railway junctions, and fortified villages that served as supply hubs for the Wehrmacht. Soviet artillery units, now better organized and equipped, delivered coordinated barrages that softened German defensive positions before infantry and armored assaults advanced. Though these attacks frequently resulted in heavy Soviet casualties, they gradually forced German forces into defensive postures, preventing them from rebuilding the offensive momentum that had characterized Barbarossa's early months. German soldiers stationed along the Moscow front faced continuous psychological and physical strain. The once confident Wehrmacht now confronted an enemy capable of launching repeated counterattacks regardless of losses. German troops spent months in defensive trenches carved into frozen ground, enduring constant artillery fire, sniper activity, and sudden night raids. Supplies remained inconsistent, and German units often relied on captured Soviet equipment or improvised repairs to maintain operational capability. Letters and diaries written by German soldiers from this period reveal a growing awareness that the Eastern Front would not deliver a quick or glorious victory, but instead demanded survival in one of the most brutal environments ever experienced by modern armies. Meanwhile, the siege of Leningrad continued as a slow and devastating campaign of starvation and bombardment. By late 1942, the civilian population had adapted to survival under siege conditions with remarkable resilience. Despite catastrophic losses during the previous winter, the city maintained essential industrial production, including artillery ammunition, small arms, and military repair workshops. Soviet engineers improvised production techniques using limited raw materials, ensuring that Leningrad remained a functioning war support center despite its isolation. German forces surrounding Leningrad also endured significant hardships. Maintaining siege lines required large numbers of troops and extensive logistical support. German soldiers stationed around the city faced harsh winters, partisan attacks, and frequent Soviet artillery strikes launched from inside the city and surrounding defensive positions. Finnish forces, operating north of Leningrad, maintained defensive lines rather than launching full-scale assaults, creating a static front that locked thousands of Axis troops into prolonged positional warfare. Throughout 1942, Soviet leadership placed increasing emphasis on breaking the siege. Several major operations were planned to reconnect Leningrad with Soviet-controlled territory. One such attempt involved coordinated assaults from forces inside the city and Soviet armies positioned east of Lake Ladoga. These operations required complex coordination across frozen terrain, swampy forests, and heavily fortified German defensive lines. Although early attempts failed to fully break the siege, they achieved partial successes by opening narrow supply corridors that allowed increased delivery of food, ammunition, and reinforcements into the starving city. The Soviet effort to sustain Leningrad also demonstrated extraordinary logistical innovation. During winter months, convoys continued using the frozen Lake Ladoga route, while summer operations relied on naval transport using barges protected by anti-aircraft defenses. Soviet engineers constructed temporary ports and supply depots along the lake's shores, enabling faster unloading and distribution of supplies. These efforts significantly improved Leningrad's survival chances and reduced civilian mortality rates compared to the catastrophic winter of 1940–1942. Inside Leningrad, daily life remained a constant struggle, yet cultural and social institutions continued functioning as symbols of resistance. Schools reopened with shortened schedules, museums preserved historical artifacts, and newspapers continued printing despite shortages of paper and ink. Propaganda posters appeared throughout the city, encouraging citizens to remain strong and continue supporting the war effort. Radio broadcasts delivered news of Soviet victories elsewhere on the Eastern Front, boosting morale among civilians who remained isolated from the outside world. As the war intensified across the Soviet Union, partisan warfare expanded dramatically in territories surrounding both Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet partisans targeted German supply lines, destroyed bridges, and ambushed isolated German convoys. These guerrilla operations disrupted German logistics and forced the Wehrmacht to divert valuable combat units to rear area security operations. German countermeasures often involved harsh reprisals against civilian populations suspected of aiding partisans, further escalating violence across occupied territories and strengthening local resistance movements. By early 1943, the strategic situation began shifting significantly. The catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad sent shockwaves across the entire Eastern Front. Although Stalingrad lay far south of Moscow and Leningrad, its impact extended across all German operations in the Soviet Union. German morale declined sharply, and Soviet commanders gained confidence in launching larger and more coordinated offensives. The Red Army increasingly demonstrated improved coordination between infantry, armored divisions, artillery, and air support, reflecting lessons learned during earlier defensive campaigns around Moscow. Encouraged by successes elsewhere, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra in January 1943, a major offensive designed specifically to break the siege of Leningrad. Soviet armies attacked German positions south of Lake Ladoga, while forces inside Leningrad advanced outward simultaneously. The operation involved massive artillery bombardments and coordinated armored assaults that overwhelmed sections of German defensive lines. After intense fighting, Soviet forces successfully opened a narrow land corridor connecting Leningrad with Soviet-controlled territory. Although the corridor remained vulnerable to German artillery and required heavy fortification, it dramatically improved supply delivery to the city. Rail lines and roads were constructed along this corridor, allowing increased transportation of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. For the first time since 1941, Leningrad maintained a relatively stable connection with the rest of the Soviet Union. The successful partial lifting of the siege marked a major psychological and strategic victory for the Soviet Union and demonstrated the gradual weakening of German siege capabilities. German forces attempted to close the corridor through repeated counterattacks, but Soviet defensive preparations and growing military strength prevented them from re-establishing full encirclement. The siege technically continued, but its deadly intensity began declining as supplies reached the city more consistently. Civilian mortality rates decreased, and industrial production within Leningrad increased steadily, contributing to broader Soviet war efforts. Meanwhile, around Moscow, Soviet forces continued launching offensive operations aimed at pushing German forces farther west. These campaigns sought to liberate occupied Soviet territories and disrupt German defensive networks. Although progress remained slow and costly, Soviet advances demonstrated increasing operational competence and improved coordination across multiple fronts. German defensive lines gradually retreated westward, marking a significant shift from Germany's earlier aggressive expansion. German leadership faced mounting strategic dilemmas. Hitler continued insisting on holding captured territories, believing that retreat would weaken German prestige and encourage Soviet advances. However, German generals increasingly recognized that maintaining extended front lines across hostile terrain drained resources and manpower. The Wehrmacht's inability to replace losses at the same rate as the Soviet Union created growing disparities in military strength. The battles for Moscow and Leningrad revealed critical differences in the war strategies of both nations. Germany relied heavily on rapid offensive operations designed to deliver decisive victories. When these offensives failed, Germany struggled to adapt to prolonged defensive warfare across vast distances. The Soviet Union, in contrast, demonstrated remarkable adaptability by reorganizing its military structure, relocating industry, and mobilizing civilian populations to support total war. The defense of Moscow and survival of Leningrad became defining examples of Soviet endurance and strategic flexibility. By late 1943, Soviet forces had gained the initiative across much of the Eastern Front. The gradual relief of Leningrad and the stabilization of Moscow allowed Soviet commanders to allocate resources toward major offensives aimed at reclaiming occupied territories. German forces, weakened by continuous losses and stretched supply lines, struggled to maintain defensive cohesion. The Eastern Front increasingly shifted from German expansion to Soviet liberation campaigns that would eventually push Axis forces back toward Eastern Europe and Germany itself. The story of Moscow and Leningrad represented more than military campaigns. These battles illustrated the transformation of modern warfare into a struggle involving entire societies, where civilians, industry, culture, and national identity became weapons as powerful as tanks and artillery. The survival of these cities demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of populations facing starvation, bombardment, and occupation. Their defense inspired Soviet soldiers and civilians across the nation, strengthening collective determination to defeat Nazi Germany. As the siege of Leningrad slowly weakened and German forces retreated from Moscow's outskirts, the broader trajectory of World War II began shifting irreversibly. Operation Barbarossa, initially envisioned as a swift conquest, had evolved into a catastrophic overextension that drained German military strength and resources. The failure to capture Moscow and destroy Leningrad denied Germany critical strategic victories and allowed the Soviet Union to rebuild its war machine. For German soldiers stationed around Moscow, daily life became a grueling routine of defensive vigilance. Soldiers faced constant Soviet probing attacks designed to test defensive strength and exhaust German manpower. Artillery duels echoed across frozen landscapes, and night raids frequently disrupted German positions. German morale, though still disciplined, began showing signs of strain. Soldiers wrote letters home describing endless cold, shortages of supplies, and fear of Soviet winter offensives. Many soldiers realized that the war in the East differed drastically from earlier campaigns in Western Europe. Instead of rapid victories, they now faced an enemy willing to endure enormous losses while continuing to fight relentlessly. The German High Command responded by shifting strategic focus toward southern Soviet territories, believing that capturing oil fields in the Caucasus would provide vital fuel resources needed to sustain the German war effort. While these new plans developed, German forces along the Moscow front adopted a defensive posture, consolidating positions and conserving strength. This shift marked a significant departure from Germany's earlier strategy of rapid, continuous offensive operations. The Wehrmacht had transitioned from aggressor to defender in key sectors of the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders saw an opportunity to maintain pressure on German forces across multiple fronts. Although Soviet offensives sometimes suffered heavy casualties due to insufficient coordination or overconfidence, they achieved important strategic goals by preventing Germany from regrouping effectively. Soviet leadership understood that time favored their growing industrial capacity and manpower reserves. Each month that Germany failed to achieve decisive victory allowed the Soviet Union to rebuild its military strength and prepare for future counteroffensives. Back in Leningrad, the siege continued with relentless brutality. During spring and summer months, melting ice on Lake Ladoga transformed the Road of Life into a water-based supply route using barges and small ships. German artillery and airstrikes continued targeting these convoys, yet Soviet forces managed to deliver enough supplies to prevent complete starvation. The city slowly restored limited agricultural production through rooftop gardens and urban farming projects. Civilians cultivated vegetables in every available open space, demonstrating extraordinary resilience in adapting to wartime scarcity. The Soviet military also launched several attempts to break the siege through offensive operations aimed at connecting Leningrad with mainland Soviet territory. These operations involved coordinated attacks from both inside and outside the encirclement ring. Although early attempts failed and resulted in heavy casualties, they forced German forces to maintain large troop deployments around the city. This prevented Germany from reallocating those troops to other critical fronts, indirectly aiding Soviet operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The human stories emerging from Leningrad during this period became powerful symbols of endurance. Diaries kept by civilians documented daily struggles for survival and emotional resilience amid overwhelming despair. Parents sacrificed their own rations to feed children. Medical staff continued treating patients despite suffering from starvation themselves. Cultural institutions preserved historical artifacts and artwork, protecting national heritage even as the city faced annihilation. These personal acts of courage formed a collective narrative that strengthened Soviet national identity and determination. As 1942 progressed, both the battles for Moscow and the siege of Leningrad demonstrated a fundamental transformation in modern warfare. The conflict had evolved into a total war where entire societies mobilized for survival. Industrial production, civilian morale, transportation networks, and agricultural output became as crucial as battlefield tactics. The Soviet Union demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to reorganize its entire national structure to support prolonged warfare, while Germany struggled to sustain its initial momentum across vast distances and harsh climates. By mid-1942, the Eastern Front had stabilized into a deadly equilibrium. Germany still controlled vast Soviet territories, but its failure to capture Moscow and Leningrad had denied Hitler the decisive victory he believed necessary to force Soviet surrender. The Soviet Union, though devastated, had survived the initial invasion and was preparing to launch major offensives that would gradually shift the balance of power. The defense of Moscow had shattered the myth of German invincibility, while the survival of Leningrad embodied the extraordinary resilience of a population fighting against starvation and destruction.